I watched my $5,000 wedding cake crash to the marble floor of the country club, 3 tiers of hand-piped roses and delicate sugarwork exploding across the white tiles. My sister Jenna stood there, with her hands covering her mouth, eyes wide with fake shock. "Oops," she whispered, then smiled that cold smile I knew so well. The room fell silent except for the sound of my heart pounding. This wasn't an accident. This was revenge because I refused to buy her a condo for her 22nd birthday last week. The morning started perfectly. I remember standing in front of the full-length mirror in the bridal suite at Willowbrook Country Club, adjusting the delicate lace sleeves of my grandmother's wedding dress. After 18 months of saving every single penny from my junior associate salary at Henderson and Associates law firm, this day represented everything I had dreamed of since meeting Marcus during our constitutional law seminar at Georgetown. Marcus and I had been together for 2 years, building our relationship through late-night study sessions, shared takeout dinners in the law library, and countless conversations about our future. He proposed last Christmas Eve in front of the Capitol building, and I knew without hesitation that he was the person I wanted to spend my life with. Planning our wedding became a labor of love, with every detail carefully chosen and budgeted. The cake had been my one splurge. Isabella Martinez, the renowned pastry chef who had created desserts for senators and diplomats, agreed to design our wedding cake. 3 tiers of vanilla bean cake with raspberry filling, covered in buttercream so smooth it looked like porcelain. Handcrafted sugar peonies cascaded down one side, each petal individually shaped and dusted with edible pearl powder. Gold leaf accents caught the light from the crystal chandelier above the dessert table. It was a work of art that cost $5,000, but seeing it that morning made every sacrifice worth it. But the perfection of that moment shattered exactly 1 week before at our engagement party in my parents' backyard. I was mingling with guests, accepting congratulations and showing off my engagement ring, when Jenna cornered me near the rose garden. She looked stunning as always, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent payment. "Wendy, I need to talk to you about something important," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted something significant. "My 22nd birthday is next month, and you know how Mom and Dad always promised we could have anything we wanted for our 22nd. I nodded cautiously. Our parents had indeed made that promise when we were children, though I had never taken it literally. When my 22nd birthday came around 4 years ago, I had asked for help with my law school application fees. Jenna apparently had bigger plans. I found the perfect condo downtown. She continued, her eyes lighting up with excitement. It's in that new high-rise on 5th Street with floor-to-ceiling windows and a balcony overlooking the river. The price is $300,000, but I already talked to Mom and Dad and they think it would be better if it came from you as a gift. I nearly choked on my champagne. Jenna, I can't afford to buy you a $300,000 condo. I'm a junior associate who just finished paying off law school loans. That's more than I make in several years. Her expression shifted from excitement to confusion, then to something darker. But you're a lawyer now. Lawyers make tons of money, and you're getting married so Marcus can help too. It's not like I'm asking for something unreasonable. It is unreasonable, I said, gently trying to maintain my composure in front of our guests. That's an enormous amount of money that I simply don't have. Maybe we can discuss other gift options that are more realistic. Jenna's face flushed red and her voice rose slightly. Other options, Wendy. This isn't some casual request. I've already put down a deposit. I told my friends I was getting this place. You can't just abandon me like this. You put down a deposit without talking to me first, I asked, genuinely shocked. Jenna, that was incredibly irresponsible. I never agreed to buy you anything that expensive. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Fine, but don't expect me to just smile and pretend everything's perfect at your precious wedding. If you want to be selfish and keep all your money to yourself, then maybe you'll understand what disappointment feels like too. The threat hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. I tried to reason with her, explaining my financial situation more clearly, but she had already turned away and was walking back toward the house. I watched her go, a sick feeling growing in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. Surely she wouldn't actually do anything to ruin my wedding over this. Now standing in the country club with cake debris scattered across the floor and 200 guests staring in stunned silence, I realized how naive I had been. Jenna had positioned herself perfectly for maximum impact. The photographer had been taking group shots of our families when she approached the dessert table ostensibly to admire the cake, but I had seen the calculating look in her eyes as she surveyed the room, timing her approach for the moment when the most people would witness the destruction. The crash was thunderous. 3 tiers of carefully crafted artistry reduced to a pile of broken beauty in less than 2 seconds. Isabella's sugar peonies lay crushed among chunks of vanilla cake and smears of raspberry filling. The gold leaf that had taken hours to apply now sparkled mockingly among the ruins. Marcus reached my side first, his face pale with shock. "Oh my God, Wendy, I'm so sorry. We can fix this somehow." But I wasn't looking at the cake anymore. I was looking at Jenna, who was now playing her role perfectly. She had started crying, dabbing at her eyes with a cocktail napkin while our mother rushed to comfort her. "It was an accident." Jenna sobbed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I was just trying to get a closer look at how beautiful it was, and I must have bumped the table. I'm so clumsy. Wendy, please forgive me. I would never do anything to hurt your special day on purpose." The performance was flawless, and I could see that most of our guests were buying it completely. After all, who would deliberately destroy a $5,000 wedding cake? Only someone who knew their sister well enough to recognize the cold calculation behind those crocodile tears. The country club's marble floor had become a battlefield of frosting and broken dreams. Guests clustered in small groups, their conversations a mixture of sympathy and shock. Some of the older ladies were already pulling out their phones, probably thinking they were being helpful by trying to find emergency bakeries that might deliver on a Saturday evening. Sandra Williams, our wedding coordinator, appeared at my elbow with the efficiency of someone who had handled countless wedding crises. Her silver hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and despite the chaos, she maintained the calm professionalism that had made her the most sought-after coordinator in the county. "Wendy, I know this is devastating, but we need to focus on solutions," she said quietly, steering me away from the crowd. "I've already called 3 bakeries that do emergency orders. Costco has some beautiful sheet cakes that we could arrange into tiers, and there's a small bakery on Oak Street that might be able to put something together if we're willing to pay premium pricing." I appreciated her efforts, but my attention kept drifting to Jenna, who was now accepting hugs and reassurances from various family members. She had positioned herself near the gift table, and something about her posture made me uneasy. My Aunt Carol was patting her shoulder while my cousin David offered her his handkerchief. "It could happen to anyone, sweetie," my mother-in-law was saying. "These things are just accidents. The important thing is that everyone is safe." Marcus squeezed my hand. "We don't need a fancy cake to celebrate our marriage," he said softly. "All we need is each other and the people who love us." His words should have been comforting, but I was distracted by a growing sense that something else was wrong. During our photos before the reception, I had placed my engagement ring and wedding band on the small crystal dish on the dessert table, a family tradition that supposedly brought good luck to the marriage. The photographer had suggested it would make for some beautiful detail shots with the cake in the background. I looked toward the dessert table now, searching for the crystal dish among the wreckage. It was still there, sitting safely away from the destroyed cake, but it was empty. My heart started pounding again, but for a different reason this time. I walked over to the table, Marcus following closely behind me, and began searching frantically among the broken cake pieces. Maybe the rings had gotten knocked off during the collision. "What are you looking for?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with concern. "My rings," I whispered, not wanting to alarm our guests further. "They were right here on the crystal dish before the cake cutting." Sandra overheard and immediately joined the search, her trained eyes scanning the area systematically. "They might have gotten thrown when the table shook," she suggested, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. The crystal dish hadn't moved an inch from its position. Meanwhile, Jenna was accepting another round of sympathetic embraces from Marcus's family. I watched her, carefully noting how she kept her small, beaded purse clutched tightly against her body, even while people were hugging her. During our engagement party, she had carried a similar purse, and I remembered how she had a habit of fidgeting with the clasp when she was nervous or excited. "I think we should check with the catering staff," Sandra suggested diplomatically. "Sometimes valuable items get moved for safekeeping during service." But I knew the catering staff hadn't touched anything on the dessert table except to light the candles. I had watched them carefully all evening, protective of Isabella's masterpiece. The only person who had been near that table in the past hour was Jenna. Marcus was now on his hands and knees, searching under chairs and around table legs, his rented tuxedo getting dusty from the floor. Several groomsmen had joined the effort, and I could see guests beginning to whisper among themselves about this new development. "Wendy, honey, what's happening now?" my mother asked, approaching with a worried expression. "People are saying something about missing rings." I looked at my mother, this woman who had always tried to keep peace between her daughters, who had spent my entire childhood making excuses for Jenna's behavior. How many times had I heard the phrase, "You know how she gets," when Jenna threw tantrums or acted out? How many times had I been asked to be the mature one to understand, to forgive? "My wedding rings are missing from the dessert table," I said clearly, loud enough for several nearby guests to hear. "They were there before the cake incident, and now they're gone." The room's energy shifted perceptibly. What had been a sympathetic gathering around an unfortunate accident now carried an undercurrent of suspicion. I could see people's eyes darting between me and Jenna, their minds starting to connect dots they didn't want to acknowledge. Jenna's tear-streaked face turned toward me with an expression of hurt confusion. "Are you suggesting that I took your rings?" she asked, her voice carrying just the right note of wounded innocence. "Wendy, how could you even think that I'm devastated enough about the cake accident? Now you're accusing me of stealing." The word accusing hung in the air like an accusation itself. I hadn't used that word, but Jenna had, and now it was out there for everyone to process. Some of our guests were nodding sympathetically at her apparent distress, while others were looking at me with confused disappointment. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," I said carefully. "I'm simply stating that my rings are missing and we need to find them." Sandra stepped in smoothly. "Why don't we contact hotel security and see if they have access to surveillance footage? That way we can track the movements around the dessert table this evening and hopefully locate where the rings might have gone." The suggestion of security footage made Jenna's eyes flicker with something that looked suspiciously like panic, though she covered it quickly with another sob. "Of course," she said bravely. "Whatever it takes to help Wendy find her rings. This day has already been ruined enough." As Sandra walked away to make the call, I found myself studying my sister's face with new eyes. The crocodile tears were still flowing, but there was something calculating in her expression when she thought no one was looking directly at her. She was playing her role perfectly, the devastated sister, whose clumsiness had accidentally caused chaos, but I was beginning to see the performance for what it really was. Marcus touched my arm gently. "Whatever happened to the rings, we'll figure it out," he said quietly. "But maybe we should focus on getting through the rest of the reception first. We can deal with this tomorrow when everyone isn't watching." He was right, of course. Our guests were becoming increasingly uncomfortable, and this was supposed to be a celebration of our marriage, not a crime scene investigation. But as I looked around the room at the faces of people who loved us, people who had spent their Saturday evening and hard-earned money to celebrate with us, I felt a burning anger building in my chest. This wasn't just about a cake or even about expensive rings. This was about respect. This was about the sanctity of one of the most important days of my life. This was about years of enabling and excuses and "you know how she gets" coming to a head in the most public and humiliating way possible. As the evening continued and we tried to salvage what remained of our reception, I made a silent promise to myself. Whatever it took, however long it took, I was going to get to the bottom of what had really happened tonight. And if Jenna thought she could manipulate and destroy and walk away with sympathy and stolen jewelry, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The night was far from over, and neither was this story. The reception limped through its final hours with the kind of forced cheer that everyone could feel, but no one acknowledged. Our band played the last dance. Guests offered their congratulations and sympathies in equal measure, and slowly the elegant ballroom emptied until only family remained. Marcus and I stood among the remnants of our celebration, surrounded by deflated centerpieces and the lingering smell of vanilla cake that now made my stomach turn. My mother approached hesitantly, her face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like guilt. Patricia Henderson had always been the peacekeeper in our family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and made excuses for everyone's behavior. Tonight she looked older than her 58 years. "Wendy, honey, we need to talk," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we were relatively private. "There are some things about Jenna that you don't know, things your father and I should have told you a long time ago." Marcus squeezed my hand. "I'll give you some privacy," he said, kissing my cheek. "I'll be helping Dad load the gifts into the car." My mother guided me to a quiet corner where we could sit on the velvet-upholstered bench beneath one of the tall windows. The country club's gardens were lit with soft landscape lighting, creating a peaceful contrast to the turmoil inside. "What kind of things?" I asked, though part of me already suspected this conversation would confirm fears I had been carrying for years. My mother took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting with her pearl necklace. "Your father and I have been financially supporting Jenna far more than you realize," she began. "We've been paying her rent, her car payment, her insurance, her credit card bills. We've given her over $50,000 in the past 2 years alone." The number hit me like a physical blow. $50,000, more than I made in a year as a junior associate. While I had worked 3 part-time jobs during law school to keep my debt manageable, while I shopped at thrift stores and ate ramen noodles to save money for this wedding, my parents had been quietly funding Jenna's lifestyle to the tune of $25,000 per year. "Why?" I managed to ask, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "Because she told us she needed help getting on her feet," my mother said, tears starting to form in her eyes. "She said her part-time job at the nonprofit wasn't enough to cover her expenses, that she was trying to build her resume for better opportunities. She promised it was temporary, that she just needed a little support while she figured things out." "Mom, she's 22 years old and she's been out of college for 6 months," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "At what point does temporary support become enabling?" My mother flinched at the word enabling, but she didn't deny it. "We know we've made mistakes," she admitted. "But every time we tried to cut back, she would have some crisis. Her car would break down, or she'd get sick and miss work, or her roommate would move out and leave her with extra rent. There was always something." I thought about my own post-college experience. My first apartment had been a studio above a dry cleaner with windows that didn't quite close and a radiator that clanged all night. I had eaten peanut butter sandwiches for dinner more nights than I cared to remember, and I had definitely never asked my parents for money beyond the occasional birthday check. The contrast was stark and painful. "There's more." My mother continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "We initially supported her request for the condo. She came to us 3 weeks ago with a complete presentation showing us floor plans and mortgage calculations. She said it would actually save us money in the long run because she wouldn't need monthly rent support anymore." "What changed your mind?" I asked. "Your father ran the numbers," she said, pulling a tissue from her purse. "Even with his promotion last year, we couldn't afford a $300,000 down payment without completely depleting our retirement savings. We had to tell her no, and that's when she came up with the idea that it should be a gift from you." The pieces were starting to form a clear picture, and I didn't like what I was seeing. "So she's been telling everyone that I'm the selfish one who won't help my sister." My mother nodded miserably. She's been calling your aunts and cousins, telling them that you make so much money as a lawyer that you could easily afford to help her, but that you're too focused on yourself and your wedding to care about family. She said you told her that your law school friends all make six figures right out of graduation and that you're just being stingy. The injustice of it made my chest feel tight. I had never told Jenna anything about my salary, mostly because it wasn't nearly as impressive as she seemed to think. Junior associates at mid-sized firms in our city started at around $45,000, and after taxes, student loan payments, and basic living expenses, there wasn't much left over. The idea that I was hoarding wealth while my struggling sister suffered was not just false, it was cruel. Did it ever occur to you or Dad to verify her claims about my financial situation? I asked. We should have, my mother admitted. But we've always tried to stay out of your business. You've been so independent since you were a teenager, working your own jobs, managing your own money. We assumed that if you weren't helping Jenna, it was because you had your own financial priorities. I could see the pain in my mother's face, and I felt a complicated mix of anger and sympathy. She and my father had been trying to help their daughter, but they had also been enabling behavior that was now spiraling out of control. They had accepted Jenna's version of events without question, which had allowed her to paint me as the villain in her story. Mom, what happened tonight wasn't an accident, I said gently but firmly. Jenna deliberately destroyed my cake as retaliation for not buying her the condo, and I think she stole my rings too. My mother's face crumpled. I was afraid you were going to say that, she whispered. Deep down, I know Jenna has problems with impulse control and telling the truth, but admitting that means accepting that we've been part of the problem for years. The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. For years, our family had operated on the unspoken agreement that we would pretend Jenna's behavior was normal, that her constant crises and demands for help were just part of her personality, rather than symptoms of deeper issues. What are we going to do? My mother asked, and for the first time in my adult life, she was asking me for guidance instead of trying to protect me from difficult truths. I looked around the nearly empty ballroom at the remnants of what should have been the happiest day of my life, and I felt something crystallize inside me. I was tired of being the understanding sister, the one who was expected to absorb Jenna's bad behavior without complaint. I was tired of watching my parents drain their retirement savings to fund my sister's irresponsibility, and I was absolutely done with being painted as the selfish villain in a story where I was actually the victim. We're going to find out exactly what happened tonight, I said with a certainty that surprised even me, and then we're going to deal with the consequences, whatever they might be. My mother nodded slowly, and I could see both fear and relief in her expression. The conversation we had been avoiding for years was finally happening, and there was no going back to the way things used to be. As we rejoined our family to finish cleaning up the reception, I caught sight of Jenna sitting at one of the abandoned tables, scrolling through her phone with a slight smile on her face. She was probably already crafting her version of tonight's events for social media, positioning herself as the tragic figure who accidentally ruined her sister's perfect day. But she had made one crucial mistake. In her arrogance and her assumption that she would never face consequences, she'd committed her crimes in a place with security cameras. And unlike our childhood home, where her tears and manipulation had always worked to erase accountability, the Willowbrook Country Club was about to provide objective evidence of exactly what had transpired. The game was changing, and Jenna didn't even know it yet. Sunday morning arrived with the gray persistence of a hangover, though I hadn't drunk enough at my own reception to justify the pounding in my head. Marcus and I sat in our hotel room at 7:30, surrounded by wedding gifts we hadn't opened and clothes we hadn't unpacked, making phone calls that no newlywed couple should have to make. Sandra Williams answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional despite the early hour. Wendy, I hope you got some rest. I've been in touch with hotel security and they're ready to review the footage with us this morning. Can you and Marcus be here by 9 too, or? We'll be there, I assured her, grateful for her efficiency. Have they said anything about what they found? They want to show you the footage rather than describe it, Sandra said carefully. But I will say this, the cameras captured quite a bit of activity around the dessert table throughout the evening. When we arrived at the country club, the elegant ballroom from the night before had been transformed back into a sterile event space, with tables stacked and linens bundled for cleaning. The romance and celebration of the previous evening felt like a dream, leaving behind only the harsh reality of what we needed to investigate. Sandra met us at the entrance with a tall, serious-looking man in a navy blue suit. "This is David Chen, head of security for the hotel chain," she said. "He's been reviewing the footage since 6 this morning." David shook our hands with the firm grip of someone accustomed to dealing with unpleasant situations. "I want you to know that we take security very seriously here," he said, as he led us toward a small office behind the front desk. "We have comprehensive coverage of all public areas, including multiple angles of the ballroom." The security office was cramped, but efficient, with a wall of monitors showing live feeds from cameras throughout the hotel. David pulled up a chair to a computer terminal and began typing. "I'm going to show you the footage chronologically, starting from when your rings were placed on the dessert table." The first clip showed me during our photo session carefully placing my engagement ring and wedding band on the crystal dish. The timestamp read 5:47 p.m. The crystal dish was positioned about 3 feet from the cake, clearly visible in the frame. "Now let's jump ahead to the period just before the cake incident," David said, fast-forwarding through several hours of footage. "I want you to pay particular attention to the movements around this area." At 8:23 p.m., Jenna appeared in the frame, approaching the dessert table from the left side. She was looking around carefully, as if checking to see who might be watching her. The camera angle showed her examining the cake closely, but more importantly, it captured her leaning over and palming something from the crystal dish with her right hand. "Can you enhance that section?" I asked, my heart pounding. David rewound and played the sequence again in slow motion. There was no question about what we were seeing. Jenna's hand moved deliberately to the crystal dish, closed around something small, and transferred whatever she had taken to her small beaded purse. "The timestamp shows 8:24 p.m., David noted. "Now let's see what happened next." The footage continued, showing Jenna stepping back from the dessert table and surveying the room again. She waited for nearly 3 minutes, during which time the photographer was organizing our families for group shots. Then, with deliberate timing, she approached the table again. This time, her movements were different. Instead of the careful, furtive behavior from before, she moved with apparent casualness, as if she were simply admiring the cake. But when she reached the table, her hip bumped against it with enough force to send the massive cake toppling. She tested the table's stability first. Marcus said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief, "Look at how she pressed against it with her hand during the first approach." David nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I observed. She was calculating the amount of force needed to make the cake fall, while making it appear accidental." The footage continued, showing Jenna's immediate reaction to the crash. Her hands flew to her mouth in apparent shock, but if you knew to look for it, you could see the slight smile that crossed her face in the split second before she arranged her features into an expression of horror. "Do you have footage of her leaving the area?" I asked. "Multiple angles." David confirmed, switching to a different camera view. "But more importantly, we have clear shots of her throughout the evening, and you can see that her purse is notably fuller after 8:24 p.m. than it was before." He showed us a series of clips from different times during the reception, and he was right. Early in the evening, Jenna's small beaded purse appeared nearly flat against her body. After the theft, it had a distinct bulge, and she kept one hand protectively over it whenever she wasn't actively embracing someone. Sandra, who had remained silent during the footage review, finally spoke up. "I've seen a lot of wedding drama in my 25 years in this business," she said slowly, "but I've never seen anything this calculated and deliberate. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. This was premeditated." I felt a strange sense of vindication mixed with profound sadness. Having proof of what I suspected was satisfying, but it also meant acknowledging that my sister was capable of a level of cruelty I hadn't fully accepted until this moment. "What are our options legally?" Marcus asked. David pulled a business card from his wallet and handed it to me. "I called Detective Sarah Rodriguez this morning and briefed her on what we found. She specializes in property crimes and is familiar with cases involving family members. She can meet with you this afternoon if you're ready to file a formal report." The weight of the decision settled over me like a heavy blanket. Filing a police report against my sister would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. It would mean acknowledging publicly that Jenna was a thief and that our family dynamics were far more dysfunctional than anyone had admitted. But as I thought about the deliberate cruelty of her actions, about the careful planning that had gone into ruining my wedding day, about the theft of rings that represented my marriage and my future, I realized that some lines needed to be crossed. "Can you make us copies of this footage?" I asked David. "Already done," he said, handing me a USB drive. "Everything is here along with my written report documenting the timeline and my observations." As we left the country club, I felt like we were crossing a threshold into territory none of us had navigated before. For my entire life, Jenna's behavior had been managed through family diplomacy, gentle corrections, and quiet cover-ups. This time, there would be consequences that extended beyond our living room. The Sunday afternoon sun felt too bright as we drove toward the police station, the USB drive containing evidence of my sister's crimes sitting in my purse like a weight. Marcus reached over and took my hand, his wedding ring catching the light. "Are you sure about this?" he asked gently. I thought about the question seriously. Was I sure? Was I ready to involve law enforcement in our family drama? Was I prepared for the consequences that would ripple through our relationships for years to come? Then I thought about Jenna's smile as the cake crashed to the floor, about the calculated theft of my rings, about years of manipulation and entitlement that had been enabled by everyone who loved her too much to hold her accountable. "Yes," I said with more certainty than I had felt in months. "I'm sure." The police station was our next stop, but it wouldn't be our last. This investigation was just beginning, and I had a feeling we were about to uncover far more than anyone in my family was prepared to face. Detective Sarah Rodriguez had the kind of steady presence that immediately put victims at ease, while probably making criminals very nervous. She was in her early 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in every detail. Her office was small but organized with commendations on the walls and a coffee mug that read, "World's Okayest Detective." "I've reviewed the security footage that Mr. Chen provided," she said, gesturing for Marcus and me to sit in the chairs across from her desk. "What we have here is clear evidence of theft and property destruction. The question is, how you want to proceed." I had spent the drive to the police station thinking about exactly that question. Part of me wanted to handle this within the family, to confront Jenna privately and demand she return my rings and pay for the cake. But the larger part of me, the part that had watched years of enabling and excuse-making, knew that private confrontations had never worked with my sister. "I want to file a formal report," I said clearly, "both for the theft of my rings and the destruction of the cake." Detective Rodriguez nodded and pulled out a form. "Let's start with the basics. Can you tell me the approximate value of the stolen items?" The engagement ring was appraised at $8,000. I said, my voice catching slightly. The wedding band was $2,000. Both were family heirlooms that had been reset for our wedding. And the cake? $5,000. We have the receipt from Isabella Martinez, the pastry chef who created it. Detective Rodriguez made notes as we talked occasionally, asking for clarification about timing or relationships. When we finished the initial report, she leaned back in her chair. "Given that this involves a family member, I'd recommend that we start with an informal approach," she said. "I'd like to interview your sister, give her an opportunity to explain the situation, and hopefully return the stolen property. Sometimes, when people see that law enforcement is involved, they make better decisions." "What if she denies everything?" Marcus asked. Then we proceed with formal charges, Detective Rodriguez said simply. The video evidence is quite compelling, but I've found that giving people a chance to do the right thing can save everyone time and heartache. She arranged to meet with Jenna that evening at my parents' house with the entire family present. The detective wanted to observe family dynamics and give Jenna every possible opportunity to confess and make restitution before moving forward with charges. The drive to my childhood home felt surreal. The tree-lined street looked exactly the same as it had throughout my adolescence, with well-maintained lawns and the kind of suburban tranquility that had always made our neighborhood feel safe and predictable. It was hard to reconcile that peaceful exterior with the criminal investigation we were about to conduct in my parents' living room. My father answered the door with the haggard expression of someone who hadn't slept well. Robert Henderson was a methodical man who worked as an engineering manager for a local manufacturing company. He preferred problems that could be solved with spreadsheets and logical analysis, and the current situation was testing all of his coping mechanisms. "Detective Rodriguez," he said formally, shaking her hand, "thank you for agreeing to handle this delicately." "I appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Henderson," she replied. "Is Jenna here?" "She's in the living room with my wife," he said, leading us through the familiar hallway past family photos that now felt like evidence of happier times. Jenna was sitting on the couch where I had spent countless hours doing homework and watching television, but she looked smaller, somehow diminished by the presence of a police detective in her childhood sanctuary. She'd been crying, and her makeup was smudged in a way that would normally evoke sympathy. "Jenna," Detective Rodriguez said, gently settling into the armchair across from her. "I'm here to talk to you about what happened at your sister's wedding yesterday evening." "It was an accident," Jenna said immediately, her voice shaky. "I would never deliberately hurt Wendy or ruin her wedding. I love my sister." Detective Rodriguez nodded patiently. "I understand that's your position, but I've reviewed security footage from the venue, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to reconsider that statement." She pulled out a tablet and showed Jenna several still images from the surveillance video. The first showed Jenna approaching the dessert table, the second captured her taking something from the crystal dish, and the third showed the moment she deliberately bumped the table to topple the cake. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. I watched my sister's face as she processed what she was seeing, watched the calculations happening behind her eyes as she tried to figure out how to respond to irrefutable evidence. "That's not what it looks like," she finally said, but her voice had lost its conviction. "I was just admiring the cake, and my rings were slipping off because I lost weight recently, so I was adjusting them." "Yeah, your rings?" Detective Rodriguez asked, raising an eyebrow. "The footage shows you taking items from your sister's crystal dish and putting them in your purse." "I meant her rings," Jenna said quickly, realizing her mistake. "I saw that they had fallen into the dish funny, so I was trying to fix them for her. I was going to put them back." The lie was so transparent that even my mother winced. Detective Rodriguez maintained her calm expression, but I could see she was taking mental notes about Jenna's willingness to fabricate explanations even when confronted with video evidence. "Jenna," I said quietly, speaking directly to my sister for the first time since the confrontation began. "Just tell the truth. We all saw what happened, and now we have proof. This is your chance to make it right." For a moment, Jenna's carefully constructed facade cracked, and I saw something raw and desperate in her expression. She looked around the room at our parents, at Marcus, at the detective, and finally back at me. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," she said, her voice rising with emotion. "Everyone expects me to have my life figured out, but I don't know what I'm doing. I can't afford to live like a normal person on what that non-profit pays me. I watch you and Marcus with your perfect relationship and your perfect careers, and I just wanted something that was mine." "So you decided to steal from me?" I asked, genuinely trying to understand her logic. "I wasn't stealing," she insisted, even as tears started flowing again. "I was just borrowing them. I thought maybe if I had something valuable I could figure out how to solve my problems. But then everyone was making such a big deal about the cake, and I panicked. Detective Rodriguez leaned forward. "Jenna, where are the rings now?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. This was the moment of truth, the point where Jenna would either commit fully to her lie or finally admit what she had done. "I don't have them," she said, but her voice was barely audible. "I'm going to ask you again," Detective Rodriguez said, her tone becoming more formal. "Where are your sister's wedding rings?" Jenna's hands went to her purse, the same beaded bag from the night before, and clutched it protectively. The gesture was so obvious that it would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. "I need to see inside your purse," Detective Rodriguez said firmly. "You can't just search my things without a warrant," Jenna replied, though she sounded uncertain. "Actually, with your family's consent and your sister's formal complaint about stolen property, I can," the detective explained. "But I'd prefer if you cooperated voluntarily." The standoff continued for several long seconds. I could see my parents exchanging glances, their faces reflecting the painful realization that their daughter was not just troubled, but actively criminal. Finally, my mother spoke up. "Jenna, honey, please just give Wendy back her rings," she said, her voice breaking. "Let's stop this before it gets any worse." Something in our mother's tone seemed to break through Jenna's defenses. She opened her purse with shaking hands and pulled out a small velvet jewelry pouch that I recognized from the jewelry store where Marcus had purchased my engagement ring. "I was going to give them back," she whispered as she handed the pouch to Detective Rodriguez. "I just needed some time to think." Detective Rodriguez opened the pouch and confirmed that both rings were inside, then handed them to me. Feeling the weight of them in my palm brought a rush of relief mixed with profound sadness. These rings represented my marriage, my future. My commitment to Marcus and my sister had stolen them as casually as she might have borrowed a sweater. "Jenna." Detective Rodriguez continued, "I need you to understand that what happened last night constitutes theft and property destruction. These are serious criminal charges that could result in jail time and permanent consequences for your future." "But I gave them back," Jenna protested. "Doesn't that matter?" "Returning stolen property after being caught doesn't erase the crime," the detective explained. "However, it can be taken into consideration during sentencing if formal charges are filed." I looked at my sister. This person I had grown up with shared a childhood with love despite everything, and tried to find some path forward that didn't involve destroying what remained of our family. But as I thought about the deliberate cruelty of her actions, about the months of planning and manipulation that had led to this moment, I realized that the destruction had already occurred. Jenna had made choices that couldn't be unmade, and consequences were now inevitable. The evening ended with Detective Rodriguez explaining the legal process that would unfold over the coming weeks. Jenna would have the opportunity to make restitution for the cake and seek counseling for her behavioral issues, but the criminal charges would proceed regardless. The video evidence was too clear, and the pattern of behavior too concerning to handle through family diplomacy alone. As we drove home through the quiet suburban streets, I twisted my engagement ring around my finger, grateful to have it back, but knowing that everything had changed. The Jenna I thought I knew, the sister I had been making excuses for my entire life, was gone. In her place was someone capable of calculated cruelty and manipulation, someone who saw my happiness as something to be destroyed rather than celebrated. The rings were back where they belonged, but the real theft had been of something much more valuable, the trust and love that had held our family together for 26 years, and unlike a piece of jewelry that couldn't simply be returned. The emergency family meeting was scheduled for Tuesday evening at my parents' house, giving everyone time to process what had happened and decide how to move forward. Detective Rodriguez had recommended that we use this gathering to address all outstanding issues before the legal process began in earnest, and I had spent the intervening days preparing myself for what might be the most difficult conversation of my life. Marcus and I arrived to find both sets of parents already gathered in the living room, their faces wearing expressions of grim determination. My father had prepared a legal pad full of notes approaching this family crisis, with the same methodical planning he brought to engineering problems. Marcus's parents, Linda and James, had insisted on being present to offer support and serve as neutral witnesses to whatever revelations might emerge. Jenna sat in the corner chair looking smaller than I had ever seen her. She had dressed carefully for the occasion in a conservative navy dress and minimal makeup, as if trying to project an image of someone who had learned from her mistakes. But her eyes held the same calculating quality. I was beginning to recognize the look of someone still trying to find an angle to work. "Before we begin," my father said, consulting his notes, "I want everyone to understand that the purpose of tonight is to establish the full scope of the problems we're dealing with. No more secrets, no more partial truths, and no more protecting anyone from consequences they've earned." It was the most direct statement I had ever heard from my diplomatic father, and it set a tone that made everyone sit up straighter. Detective Rodriguez had provided us with a summary of Jenna's rights and the charges she would face, but she had also mentioned that cooperation with the investigation could influence how the case proceeded. What none of us were prepared for was how much more there was to uncover. "Jenna." My mother began, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "We need you to tell us about the credit application that came in the mail yesterday." I saw Jenna's face go pale, and I realized that there were developments I hadn't been told about yet. My father shuffled through his papers and pulled out what appeared to be an official-looking letter. "This is from First National Bank," he explained, his engineering background evident in his precise delivery. "It's a denial notice for a personal loan application in the amount of $30,000, an application that was submitted with my forged signature." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Identity theft and forgery were federal crimes far more serious than stealing rings or destroying a wedding cake. I watched Jenna's face as she processed being caught in yet another lie, saw her mind working to construct an explanation that might minimize the damage. "I can explain that," she said quickly, her voice taking on the pleading tone she had used to get out of trouble since childhood. "I was trying to get the loan so I could pay you and Mom back for all the money you've been giving me. I thought if I could just get enough to be independent, I wouldn't need to ask you for help anymore." "So you decided to commit identity theft?" my father asked, his voice remarkably calm given the circumstances. "You forged my signature on a legal document, Jenna. Do you understand that this could have destroyed my credit and put me at risk for fraud charges?" "I knew you wouldn't get in trouble because I was going to pay it back," Jenna said, as if this logic made perfect sense. "I had a plan." Marcus's father, James, spoke up for the first time. "Jenna, what was your plan for paying back $30,000 when you're currently unable to support yourself on your regular income?" The question hung in the air, exposing the fundamental flaw in Jenna's reasoning. She had no plan because there was no realistic way for someone in her financial situation to handle that kind of debt. The loan application had been an act of desperation, not careful planning. "I was going to use the money to start a business." She said, though, even she seemed to realize how weak this sounded. There are lots of online opportunities for people who have startup capital. My mother looked stricken. "Jenna, honey, those online business opportunities are usually scams. You would have lost the money and been left with debt you couldn't pay." "But the bank denied the application anyway." My father continued, returning to his notes. "Which brings us to the bigger question: if you were expecting $30,000 that you didn't get, how did you pay for the expensive items that have been delivered to our house over the past month?" I saw Jenna's eyes widen as she realized she had been caught in another lie. My parents had clearly been doing their own investigation, and they had uncovered evidence of spending that didn't match Jenna's claimed financial struggles. "What expensive items?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer would be worse than anything we had discussed so far. My father pulled out a second sheet of paper. "Designer clothes totaling over $2,000, a new laptop computer, expensive skincare products, and jewelry. All delivered to our address, all charged to credit cards that Jenna claimed she was trying to pay off with our help." The pattern was becoming clear, and it painted a picture of someone living completely beyond her means while manipulating family members to subsidize her lifestyle. But there was still something that didn't add up. If the loan was denied, where did the money come from? Marcus asked, voicing the question we were all thinking. Jenna looked around the room desperately as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Finally, she seemed to deflate, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I've been taking money from other places," she admitted. "Not just from you and Dad, from Grandma's purse when I visit her, from Mom's jewelry box when I thought you wouldn't notice. I used Dad's credit card a few times for small purchases that I thought would get lost in your monthly statement." The confession hit our parents like a series of physical blows. My mother gasped and covered her mouth with her hands, while my father's face went through a series of expressions ranging from shock to anger to profound disappointment. "How much money are we talking about?" my father asked, his voice tight with control. "I don't know exactly," Jenna said, tears starting to flow. "Maybe a few $1,000s over the past 6 months. I kept telling myself I would pay it back when I got the loan." "A few $1,000s, my mother repeated, as if trying to process the magnitude of what her daughter had just confessed. "Jenna, you've been stealing from your own family for months." "I wasn't stealing," Jenna protested weakly. "I was borrowing. I always planned to pay it back." "Taking money without permission is stealing," Marcus's mother said firmly, speaking up for the first time. "It doesn't matter what you plan to do later." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the full scope of Jenna's deception. This wasn't just about wedding cake or missing rings anymore. This was about months of systematic theft from family members, identity fraud, and a level of financial irresponsibility that bordered on pathological. "There's something else," my father said quietly, and I could see that delivering this information was causing him physical pain. "I called the bank to discuss the fraudulent application, and they informed me that this isn't the first time someone has attempted to use my identity for credit applications." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I was dreading the answer. "There have been 2 other attempts in the past year," he explained. "Both were denied because of security measures the bank has in place, but both used my social security number and personal information that only someone close to our family would know." Everyone's eyes turned to Jenna, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the furniture. The evidence was circumstantial, but given everything we had learned about her behavior, the implications were clear. "I only tried once," she said quickly. "I don't know about any other applications." "Jenna," my mother said, her voice breaking, "please stop lying to us. We're trying to help you, but we can't do that if you won't tell us the truth." The plea seemed to break something inside my sister. She began sobbing with the kind of desperate intensity that comes from being completely cornered, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, her tears seemed genuine. "I don't know how it got this bad," she cried. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I just wanted to have nice things like everyone else. I wanted to feel successful and independent, but everything cost so much money and I couldn't figure out how to make it work." The admission was heartbreaking in its honesty, but it also revealed the fundamental problem that had led to this crisis. Jenna had been living in a fantasy world where she deserved a lifestyle she couldn't afford, and when reality failed to meet her expectations, she had chosen to steal and manipulate rather than adjust her expectations. As the evening continued, we worked through the practical implications of what we had learned. My parents would need to monitor their credit reports and potentially freeze their accounts. The various thefts would need to be documented for the police investigation, and our family would need to figure out how to rebuild trust that had been systematically destroyed over months of deception. The conversation ended with Jenna agreeing to cooperate fully with the criminal investigation and to seek counseling for her behavioral issues. But as I watched her promise to change to get help to make amends, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another performance, another attempt to manipulate her way out of consequences. The sister I had grown up with, the person I had loved and protected and made excuses for, was gone. In her place was someone I barely recognized, someone capable of stealing from elderly grandparents and committing identity fraud against her own father. As Marcus and I drove home that night, I found myself grieving not just for what Jenna had done, but for who she had turned out to be. Sometimes the people we love most are capable of hurting us in ways we never imagined possible. And sometimes the only loving thing to do is to stop protecting them from the consequences of their choices. The legal process would continue, but the family I had grown up in was forever changed. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt truly at peace with that reality. The police station on Thursday morning buzzed with the organized chaos of law enforcement preparing for another day of keeping the community safe. Detective Rodriguez met us in the lobby with a folder thick enough to suggest that our case had grown significantly since our last meeting. Before we proceed with the formal charges, she explained as she led us back to her office, I want you to understand what we've discovered through our preliminary investigation. She gestured for Marcus and me to sit, then spread several documents across her desk like she was dealing cards in a game with very high stakes. When I ran your sister's name through our system after Tuesday's family meeting, I found some concerning information. She began. Jenna has been flagged in multiple ongoing investigations related to online fraud and identity theft. The words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Multiple investigations. 3 different credit card companies have reported suspicious activity linked to accounts in her name. Detective Rodriguez explained, pulling out a summary report. In each case, large purchases were made immediately before the cardholder called to report the card stolen or compromised. Marcus leaned forward. Are you saying she's been stealing credit cards? Not exactly, the detective clarified. What appears to be happening is more sophisticated. She's been using dating apps and social media to develop relationships with people, gaining their trust and then finding ways to access their financial information. She showed us printouts of social media profiles that I barely recognized as belonging to my sister. The photos were clearly Jenna, but everything else about the profiles was fabricated. In one, she claimed to be a graduate student in marine biology. In another, she was a freelance graphic designer who had traveled extensively through Europe. These profiles have been active for approximately 8 months, Detective Rodriguez continued. We believe she's been using them to target lonely individuals, particularly older men, who are recently divorced or widowed. The systematic nature of what she was describing made my stomach turn. This wasn't impulsive stealing from family members or desperate attempts to solve immediate financial problems. This was predatory behavior, targeting vulnerable people who were looking for genuine human connection. How many victims are we talking about? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Detective Rodriguez consulted another document. So far, we've identified 12 individuals who report being scammed by someone matching your sister's description and methods. The total amount stolen is approximately $15,000, though we suspect there may be additional victims who haven't come forward yet. $15,000 stolen from strangers on top of the thousands she'd taken from our family. The scope of Jenna's criminal activity was staggering, and it painted a picture of someone whose behavior had escalated far beyond anything our family had imagined. What exactly was her method? Marcus asked. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Detective Rodriguez explained, pulling up screenshots of text conversations on her computer. She would initiate contact through dating apps, develop an emotional connection over several weeks, and then introduce some kind of financial crisis that required immediate assistance. She showed us examples of the conversations, and I was horrified by how manipulative and calculated they were. Jenna had crafted elaborate stories about medical emergencies, car accidents, and family crises that required money transfers before banks could process legitimate transactions. In every case, she promised immediate repayment and expressed overwhelming gratitude for the victim's kindness and generosity. The victims range in age from 55 to 78, Detective Rodriguez continued. Most are men who lost spouses in the past few years and were genuinely seeking companionship. Your sister exploited their loneliness and their desire to be helpful to someone they cared about. One victim, a 72-year-old retired teacher named Harold, had sent Jenna nearly $3,000 after she claimed her mother had been diagnosed with cancer and needed immediate treatment that insurance wouldn't cover. Harold had been widowed 6 months earlier and thought he had found someone who understood his grief. The cruelest part, Detective Rodriguez noted, is that she maintained these fake relationships for weeks or even months after receiving money. The victims believed they were in genuine romantic relationships with someone who cared about them. As she described the details of each case, I felt a growing sense of horror at what my sister had become. These weren't crimes of desperation or momentary poor judgment. They were carefully planned acts of emotional and financial exploitation, targeting some of the most vulnerable members of our community. "What happens next?" I asked. Given the interstate nature of some of these crimes and the sophisticated fraud involved, federal authorities are taking over the investigation, Detective Rodriguez explained. The wedding incident and the family thefts will still be prosecuted at the state level, but the romance scams fall under federal jurisdiction. She handed me a business card for Agent Patricia Williams from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit. Agent Williams specializes in online fraud cases and will be the lead investigator moving forward. She'll want to interview you and your family about Jenna's behavior patterns and any other information that might help them build their case. The transition from local police matter to federal investigation felt like crossing into territory I had never imagined our family would need to navigate. FBI agents, federal charges, potential federal prison time. These were consequences that seemed to belong in movies rather than in the life of a small-town lawyer whose biggest previous legal challenge had been a disputed parking ticket. "Will she be arrested?" Marcus asked. "That decision will ultimately be up to the federal prosecutor," Detective Rodriguez said. "But given the number of victims and the amount of money involved, plus the evidence of ongoing criminal activity, I would expect formal charges to be filed within the next week or two." As we left the police station, I felt like I was walking through someone else's life. The Jenna I had grown up with, the sister who had shared a bedroom with me for 16 years, who had helped me practice for school presentations and borrowed my clothes without asking, had been living a double life as a federal criminal. The scope of her deception was breathtaking. While our family had been worrying about her ability to pay rent and car insurance, she'd been operating sophisticated fraud schemes that targeted innocent people across multiple states. While we had been making excuses for her immaturity and poor financial decisions, she had been developing fake identities and manipulating lonely strangers into sending her money. That evening, as Marcus and I sat in our apartment trying to process everything we had learned, I found myself wondering if I had ever really known my sister at all. The person who could create fake profiles to manipulate grieving widowers, who could steal thousands of dollars from elderly grandparents, who could destroy her sister's wedding as an act of revenge, that person was a stranger wearing my sister's face. The phone rang at 8:30, and I recognized the number as belonging to Harold, the retired teacher, who'd been scammed out of $3,000. Detective Rodriguez had given him my contact information so he could speak directly with Jenna's family about the impact of her crimes. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice carrying the dignity of someone who had spent decades educating children. "I hope you don't mind me calling. I just wanted you to know that I don't blame your family for what happened." His kindness in the face of such betrayal brought tears to my eyes. "I'm so sorry for what she did to you," I managed to say. "I know you are," he replied gently. "But I also want you to know that your sister's actions don't reflect on the rest of you. I was a teacher for 42 years, and I learned to distinguish between children who made bad choices and children who were inherently bad. Your sister made terrible choices, but that doesn't make your whole family responsible. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Harold's wisdom had given me something I hadn't expected: permission to love my family while still holding Jenna accountable for her actions. The crimes she had committed were her choices, her responsibility, and her consequences to face. The federal investigation would continue, and our family would have to rebuild from the foundation up. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like we might actually be able to do that. The federal charges were filed on Monday morning, making our family's private crisis a matter of public record. The local newspaper ran a brief article about the arrest, identifying Jenna by name and describing her as being charged with wire fraud and identity theft in connection with an online romance scam operation. By Tuesday afternoon, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets, and by Wednesday, it was trending on social media platforms throughout our state. I had returned to work at Henderson and Associates, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy while dealing with the aftermath of our family crisis. My colleagues were supportive but curious, and I found myself having awkward conversations about federal investigations and family estrangement with people who had known me as the reliable junior associate who never caused drama. Marcus and I had decided to take a brief honeymoon the following week, just a long weekend at a cabin in the mountains, where we could disconnect from the legal proceedings and media attention. We'd already rearranged our work schedules and made reservations, looking forward to 3 days of hiking and reading and remembering why we had gotten married in the first place, which made returning to our apartment Thursday evening to find our front door hanging open even more jarring than it might have been otherwise. Marcus grabbed my arm before I could walk inside. "We're calling the police first," he said, firmly pulling out his phone. "Don't touch anything until they've cleared the scene." The responding officers arrived within minutes and conducted a methodical sweep of our apartment before allowing us to enter. What we found inside looked like the aftermath of a tornado, with very specific targeting preferences. Our living room had been largely untouched, but our home office had been completely destroyed. My law school diplomas, which had hung framed on the wall above my desk, were torn into pieces and scattered across the floor. My bar certification, which represented years of study and thousands of dollars in fees, had been ripped in half and left on my keyboard like a calling card. The awards I had earned during law school, recognition for academic achievement, community service, and legal writing, were broken and thrown around the room. My legal textbooks, which I had kept both for sentimental reasons and as reference materials, had pages torn out and covers damaged. Even my business cards, which had been neatly arranged in a holder on my desk, were scattered and torn up. But the destruction wasn't random vandalism. It was surgical in its precision, targeting only items that represented my professional achievements and legal career. Our television, computer, jewelry, and other valuable items were untouched. This wasn't about theft. It was about sending a message. Officer Martinez, who was documenting the scene, found evidence of how entry had been gained. "Looks like someone used a key," she said, pointing to the undamaged lock mechanism. "No signs of forced entry, no picked locks. Whoever did this had legitimate access to your apartment." Marcus and I exchanged glances. The only people who had spare keys to our apartment were my parents, and I trusted them completely. But then I remembered something that made my blood run cold. Jenna copied my parents' spare key about 6 months ago. I said slowly, the memory coming back to me. She said she wanted to be able to water their plants when they went out of town, but she could have made additional copies. Officer Martinez made notes while we called my parents to confirm that their spare key was missing. My mother's voice shook as she searched her kitchen drawer and confirmed that the key I had given them for emergencies was no longer there. "She must have taken it weeks or months ago," my mother said. "We never thought to check after everything that happened with the wedding." As we continued surveying the damage, I found something that made the situation even more disturbing. My personal laptop, which I had left charging on the bedroom dresser, was missing, along with a folder containing my personal financial documents and tax returns. "This is escalating beyond property damage," Officer Martinez observed. "Identity theft, breaking and entering, and targeted harassment of a witness in a federal case. Your sister is in serious legal jeopardy." But the real shock came the next morning when I arrived at work to find my phone buzzing with calls and messages from colleagues, clients, and law school friends. Jenna had apparently spent the night creating a comprehensive social media campaign designed to destroy my professional reputation. Using fake accounts she had created months earlier, she had posted detailed allegations about my supposed drug use, claiming to have witnessed me using cocaine at my own wedding. She described fictional incidents of me being intoxicated during family gatherings and made up stories about erratic behavior during law school that supposedly concerned our professors. But the posts weren't just random accusations. They were sophisticated in their details and targeted in their distribution. She had tagged my law firm, my former professors, several prominent attorneys in our area, and even some of my current clients. She had researched the social media accounts of people in my professional network and crafted her lies to maximum exposure and credibility damage. The posts included altered photos that appeared to show me in compromising situations, and she had created fake testimonials from supposed law school classmates who corroborated her claims. She had even gone so far as to create a fake account for a fictional intervention counselor, posting about the importance of reporting addicted attorneys to the State Bar Association. My phone rang constantly as people called to ask if the allegations were true, if I needed help, or if they should be concerned about working with me. The managing partner at my firm, Janet Henderson, called an emergency meeting to discuss how we should respond to what she tactfully referred to as reputation management challenges. "Obviously, we don't believe any of these allegations," she assured me in her office that morning, "but we need to be proactive about protecting both you and the firm from the fallout. False accusations can be just as damaging as true ones if they're not handled properly." She had already contacted the firm's defamation attorney and had begun documenting all of Jenna's posts for potential legal action. But the damage to my professional relationships was immediate and potentially lasting. Even people who didn't believe the allegations would remember them, and clients might choose to work with attorneys who weren't surrounded by controversy. "Has your sister been arrested yet for the break-in?" Janet asked. "They're working on locating her," I said. "She hasn't been staying at my parents' house, and her apartment lease was terminated last month for non-payment. She could be anywhere." Agent Williams from the FBI called that afternoon with an update on the federal investigation. "We're treating the break-in and social media harassment as additional charges related to witness intimidation," she explained. "Your sister appears to be trying to pressure you to drop your cooperation with our investigation." "Is that something people actually try?" I asked. "Unfortunately, yes," Agent Williams said. "When people realize they're facing serious federal time, they sometimes become desperate and start making poor decisions that only make their situation worse. Your sister's behavior fits a pattern we see in cases involving family members who serve as witnesses." She explained that Jenna's actions over the past few days had actually strengthened the federal case against her by demonstrating a pattern of ongoing criminal behavior and a lack of remorse for her previous crimes. "The good news is that we have extensive evidence of the social media harassment campaign," Agent Williams continued. "Creating false allegations against a witness in a federal case is itself a federal crime, punishable by up to 10 years in prison." 10 years in prison. For someone who was 22 years old, that represented nearly half of her adult life so far. The consequences of Jenna's choices were escalating beyond anything our family had imagined when this started with a destroyed wedding cake. As I sat in my apartment that evening, surrounded by the remnants of my destroyed professional certificates and dealing with the ongoing fallout from Jenna's social media attack, I found myself wondering if there was anything I could have done differently. Should I have tried harder to get her help years ago? Should I have recognized the warning signs of her escalating behavior? But as I looked at Marcus, who was patiently helping me sort through the damaged documents and research options for replacing my bar certification, I realized that those questions were irrelevant. I couldn't change Jenna's choices, and I couldn't control the consequences of her actions. All I could do was protect myself and my marriage from further damage and continue cooperating with law enforcement to ensure that justice was served. The sister I had grown up with was gone, replaced by someone capable of breaking into my home and systematically trying to destroy my career out of spite. That transformation was heartbreaking, but it was also liberating in a strange way. I no longer had to wonder if I was being too harsh or if there was some explanation that would make her behavior understandable. There was no explanation that could justify what she had done. There was only the choice to protect myself and move forward with my life, with or without her in it. The arrest happened at 6:30 Friday morning at a motel on the outskirts of town, where Jenna had been staying since her apartment lease was terminated. Agent Williams called me an hour later with the news, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had successfully concluded a challenging investigation. "We found your laptop and documents in her possession, along with evidence of additional fraud schemes she was developing," Agent Williams explained. "She's been charged with wire fraud, identity theft, witness intimidation, breaking and entering, and harassment. The federal prosecutor is recommending that she be held without bail pending trial." Without bail. The words carried a weight that made the situation feel suddenly definitively real. My sister, the person who used to braid my hair and help me with algebra homework, would be spending the foreseeable future in federal custody, awaiting trial for crimes that could send her to prison for decades. Marcus squeezed my hand as I absorbed the news. We were sitting in our kitchen surrounded by boxes of documents that our insurance company needed to process claims for the destroyed professional certificates and damaged property. The normalcy of the breakfast dishes in the sink and the morning sunlight streaming through our windows felt surreal compared to the gravity of what Agent Williams was telling me. "There's something else you need to know," Agent Williams continued. "During the investigation, we discovered that your sister's criminal activity is significantly more extensive than we initially realized." She explained that the search of Jenna's motel room and her electronic devices had revealed evidence of romance scams targeting victims across multiple states and international borders. She had been operating under at least 8 different fake identities, using sophisticated techniques to avoid detection while systematically bilking lonely individuals out of their savings. "We're now looking at potential victims in 12 states and 3 countries," Agent Williams said. "The total amount of money involved is approaching $100,000, and we're still investigating additional cases." $100,000. The number was staggering, representing a level of criminal enterprise that transformed Jenna from a troubled young woman making poor decisions into a professional fraud operator. The scope of her deception suggested months or even years of careful planning and execution. "How did she manage to avoid detection for so long?" I asked. "She was sophisticated in her methods," Agent Williams admitted. "She used virtual private networks to mask her location, created fake social media profiles with stolen photos, and maintained detailed records of her victims' personal information to make her stories more convincing. This wasn't amateur hour. She had developed genuine expertise in online fraud techniques." The conversation continued with Agent Williams explaining the legal process that would unfold over the coming months. Given the federal charges and the multi-state nature of the crimes, Jenna would be prosecuted in federal court, where sentences tend to be longer and parole opportunities more limited than in state courts. "Based on the evidence we have, she's looking at 15 to 25 years in federal prison," Agent Williams said matter-of-factly. "The prosecutor might consider a plea agreement if she cooperates fully and provides information about other fraud operations she may have encountered. But even with cooperation, she's facing significant prison time." 15 to 25 years. For someone who was 22 years old, that essentially meant spending her entire young adulthood in federal prison. The magnitude of the consequences was difficult to comprehend, especially for someone who had grown up thinking of Jenna as irresponsible rather than criminal. After the call ended, Marcus and I sat in silence for several minutes processing what we had learned. The sister I had been trying to help and understand for the past 2 weeks had been operating a sophisticated criminal enterprise while living in our parents' house and accepting their financial support. She had been stealing from elderly victims while crying about her inability to pay rent. She had been developing multiple fake identities while complaining about feeling lost and directionless. The level of deception was breathtaking in its scope and duration. While our family had been worrying about her emotional well-being and offering guidance about career development, she had been perfecting techniques for exploiting vulnerable people's loneliness and trust. My phone rang again, and I recognized the number as belonging to Harold, the retired teacher, who had been one of Jenna's victims. I had given him my contact information so he could stay informed about the case, and he had become an unexpected source of wisdom and perspective during this difficult time. I heard about the arrest on the morning news, he said, his voice carrying both relief and sadness. How are you holding up with all of this? I'm not sure, I answered honestly. Part of me is relieved that she can't hurt anyone else, but part of me is devastated by what she turned out to be. That's a perfectly normal reaction, Harold assured me. When someone we love betrays our trust this completely, we grieve for both what they did and who they turned out to be. You're mourning the sister you thought you had. His insight was exactly what I needed to hear. I had been struggling to understand my own emotional responses to Jenna's arrest, feeling guilty for experiencing relief alongside the sadness. Harold's perspective helped me recognize that both feelings were valid and necessary parts of processing such a profound betrayal. Can I ask you something? I said. Do you regret trying to help her? Are you angry that your kindness was exploited? Harold was quiet for a moment before answering. I've thought about that a lot over the past 2 weeks, he said finally, and I've decided that I don't regret being someone who tries to help people in need. Your sister exploited that quality, but that doesn't make it a flaw worth changing. What do you mean? If I become cynical and stop trusting people because of what she did, then she wins twice, Harold explained. She gets my money and she gets to change who I am as a person. I won't give her that power. His wisdom stayed with me as the weekend progressed and we began the process of rebuilding our lives from the chaos Jenna had created. Our apartment slowly returned to normal as we replaced damaged items and reorganized our home office. The social media posts were gradually taken down as platform administrators responded to our reports of harassment and false information. Monday morning brought a call from the district attorney's office with news that would reshape how I thought about justice and accountability. District Attorney Michael Thompson wanted to meet with us to discuss the possibility of Jenna providing testimony about other criminal operations she had encountered during her fraud activities. We believe your sister may have information about organized romance scam operations that could help us prosecute other criminals who are targeting elderly victims, DA Thompson explained during our meeting at his office. If she cooperates fully and provides useful intelligence, it could reduce her sentence significantly. The idea that Jenna might actually help law enforcement catch other criminals was both hopeful and deeply ironic. The same skills and knowledge she had used to commit crimes could potentially be redirected toward preventing other people from being victimized. What kind of cooperation are we talking about? Marcus asked. Detailed information about the website's communication methods and organizational structures of the fraud operations she encountered, DA Thompson explained. Your sister appears to have been operating independently, but she would have encountered other scammers' learned techniques from online forums and possibly worked with money laundering operations to convert stolen funds. The possibility that Jenna's cooperation could lead to arrests of other criminals who were targeting vulnerable elderly victims gave the situation a dimension I hadn't anticipated. Perhaps some good could come from this nightmare if her knowledge could be used to protect other families from similar devastation. As we left the district attorney's office, I found myself cautiously optimistic about the possibility that Jenna might finally start making choices that helped rather than harmed other people. The consequences of her crimes would remain severe, but at least she might have the opportunity to begin making amends by helping prevent other victims. The legal process was far from over, but for the first time since this entire ordeal began, it felt like we were moving toward resolution rather than deeper into chaos. Justice was finally beginning to take its course, and our family could start the long process of healing from the betrayal and rebuilding our relationships on a foundation of truth rather than enabling and denial. The sister I had grown up with was gone, but perhaps the person she became in prison might eventually develop into someone capable of genuine remorse and positive contributions to society. That hope, however fragile, was something worth holding on to as we moved forward into an uncertain but more honest future. The phone call from my mother came at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after Jenna's arrest. Her voice was shaking with a combination of panic and exhaustion that I had never heard before, even during the worst moments of our recent family crisis. "Wendy, we need you to come over right away," she said without preamble. "There's been another development and your father and I don't know what to do." Marcus and I threw on clothes and drove through the empty suburban streets to my childhood home, where we found my parents sitting at their kitchen table, surrounded by official-looking documents and collection notices. My father looked like he had aged 10 years in the past month, his usually neat appearance disheveled and his eyes red-rimmed with fatigue. "What's happened?" I asked, sitting down across from them. My mother pushed a stack of papers toward me. "We've been receiving calls all week from people claiming that Jenna stole money from them," she said. "At first, we thought they were just angry about the news coverage and were taking it out on us. But then, Harold called." Harold, the retired teacher who had become our unlikely ally throughout this ordeal, had contacted my parents after receiving calls from other elderly victims who had tracked down our family's contact information. What he discovered through his conversations with these victims was more devastating than anything we had uncovered so far. Jenna has been using our personal information in her scam operations. My father explained, his voice barely above a whisper. She told her victims that she was our daughter, gave them our real address and phone number, and used details about our family history to make her stories more convincing. The implications hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just that Jenna had stolen money from strangers. She had used our family's identity and reputation as tools in her criminal enterprise. The victims didn't just think they had been scammed by a random criminal. They believed they had been betrayed by members of our specific family. "How many people are we talking about?" Marcus asked. 17 that we know of so far. My mother said, tears starting to flow again. "They've been calling constantly, some of them, demanding that we pay back the money Jenna stole, others just wanting answers about how we could have raised someone capable of such cruelty." She showed me transcripts of some of the phone calls she had been documenting. An 84-year-old widow named Dorothy had sent Jenna $2,000 after being told that our father was dying of cancer and needed experimental treatment that insurance wouldn't cover. A retired veteran named Frank had contributed $1,500 to what he believed was a fund for our mother's emergency surgery. She used our real medical histories, my father said, his voice breaking. "She knew that I had a cancer scare 5 years ago and she told people it had come back. She knew about your mother's gallbladder surgery and turned it into a story about complications that required expensive treatment." The cruelty of using our family's genuine medical concerns as raw material for fraud schemes was breathtaking. Jenna had taken the private fears and vulnerabilities that we had shared with her during family conversations and weaponized them against innocent people who thought they were helping a family in crisis. "There's more." My mother continued, pushing another stack of documents toward me. "We've discovered that Jenna has been using your father's identity for more than just loan applications." The papers revealed a systematic pattern of identity theft that had been going on for over a year. Jenna had opened credit card accounts in my father's name, applied for store financing using his social security number, and even attempted to open a business bank account using forged documentation that claimed he was starting a consulting company. The credit card companies have been calling for months, my father explained. We kept getting bills for accounts we didn't recognize, but when we called to dispute them, Jenna would intercept the mail and handle the calls herself. She convinced us that it was just bureaucratic errors that she would take care of. The scope of her manipulation of our parents was staggering. She hadn't just been stealing money from them directly. She'd been using their identities to create credit accounts that she maxed out, leaving them responsible for debts they didn't know existed. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. My father consulted a handwritten ledger where he had been trying to calculate their total exposure. $43,000 in credit card debt that we didn't know about. Another $18,000 in store financing for purchases we never made. And now these victims are demanding reimbursement for another $27,000 in romance scam losses. Nearly $90,000. The number was devastating, representing more than twice my father's annual salary and essentially wiping out their retirement savings. At ages 58 and 61, they were facing the possibility of working for the rest of their lives to pay off debts incurred by their criminal daughter. "We've contacted our attorney," my mother said, but he says that even though we're clearly victims of identity theft, proving that in court is going to be expensive and time-consuming. Meanwhile, the collection agencies don't care about our family drama. They just want their money. The phone rang as we were talking, and my mother answered with the weary resignation of someone who had been fielding these calls for weeks. I could hear an elderly man's voice on the other end, angry and demanding, asking why our family hadn't paid back the money we owed him. "Sir, I understand your frustration," my mother said patiently, "but we are also victims of our daughter's crimes. We didn't know she was using our family's information to defraud people." "That's what they all say," the man replied, his voice loud enough for all of us to hear. "How could you not know what your own daughter was doing? You people raised a criminal, and now you want to pretend you're innocent victims." The accusation hung in the air after my mother ended the call. While the caller's anger was misdirected, his pain was real and justified. From his perspective, our family represented the people who had betrayed his trust and stolen his money. The distinction between Jenna's individual crimes and our family's collective responsibility wasn't clear to him, and I couldn't entirely blame him for that confusion. "This is destroying your father's health," my mother said quietly after we had reviewed all the documentation. "He hasn't slept more than a few hours a night since this started. His blood pressure is through the roof, and he's developed an anxiety disorder that requires medication." I looked at my father, this man who had worked steadily for 37 years, who had never missed a mortgage payment or failed to honor a commitment, who had raised 2 daughters and tried to provide them with every opportunity for success. The stress of dealing with Jenna's crimes had transformed him into someone I barely recognized, haunted, defeated, and aged beyond his years. "What can we do to help?" Marcus asked. "We don't know," my father admitted. "Our attorney says we should file for bankruptcy to protect ourselves from the debt collectors, but that would destroy our credit rating and make it impossible to refinance our house. We're trapped between paying for crimes we didn't commit and ruining our financial future." The conversation continued late into the night as we worked through the practical implications of their situation. Harold had organized a support group for Jenna's elderly victims, and several of them had expressed willingness to testify that my parents were not involved in the scam operations. But the credit card debt and identity theft issues would require extensive legal proceedings that could take years to resolve. "I keep thinking about what we could have done differently," my mother said as the evening wound down. "Were there signs we missed? Could we have gotten her help before it reached this point?" It was a question that had been haunting our entire family since Jenna's arrest. Had we enabled her behavior by providing financial support? Had we ignored warning signs that should have been obvious? Were we partially responsible for the victim's losses because we had failed to intervene earlier? "The only person responsible for Jenna's choices is Jenna," I said firmly. "You can't blame yourselves for trying to help your daughter or for not predicting that she would become a criminal." But even as I said the words, I could see that my parents were struggling with guilt that went beyond rational analysis. They were facing financial ruin and social ostracism because of their daughter's crimes, and the temptation to find some way they could have prevented this outcome was overwhelming. As Marcus and I drove home through the pre-dawn darkness, I found myself grappling with questions about family responsibility and the limits of love. How much accountability do parents bear for their adult children's choices? At what point does supporting a struggling family member cross the line into enabling criminal behavior? There were no easy answers, but one thing was clear: our family would never be the same. The financial devastation was serious enough, but the emotional cost was even greater. The trust and love that had held us together for decades had been systematically exploited and destroyed by someone we had tried to help and protect. The phone rang again as we pulled into our driveway, and I could see from the caller ID that it was another unknown number, probably another victim looking for answers or restitution. The calls would continue, the collection agencies would keep demanding payment, and my parents would spend years trying to rebuild their financial and emotional security from the ruins of Jenna's criminal enterprise. But they wouldn't face it alone. Whatever it took, however long it took, Marcus and I would help them navigate this nightmare and find a path forward. The sister I had grown up with had tried to destroy our family, but she hadn't succeeded completely. What remained of our family would be smaller and more cautious, but it would also be built on truth rather than denial. And sometimes starting over with truth is the only path toward genuine healing. The bankruptcy attorney's office smelled like leather furniture polish and disappointment decorated with the kind of expensive furniture that was probably intended to inspire confidence, but instead reminded me of funeral parlors. Richard Cross had been practicing financial law for 28 years, and his matter-of-fact delivery suggested he had seen every possible variation of family financial destruction. "Your parents' situation is complicated, but not hopeless," he explained, spreading their financial documents across his mahogany conference table. "The key is establishing a clear timeline of when they became aware of your sister's criminal activity and documenting their cooperation with law enforcement." Marcus and I had insisted on accompanying my parents to this consultation, partly to provide moral support and partly because my legal training might be useful in understanding the options available to them. What I hadn't expected was to discover that my own expertise in civil procedure could be directly applicable to our family crisis. "There's another approach we should consider," I said as Mr. Cross outlined the bankruptcy timeline: "civil asset forfeiture and victim restitution. If we can trace the stolen funds and identify recoverable assets, we might be able to get some of this money back." Mr. Cross raised an eyebrow with the kind of interest that suggested I had mentioned something he hadn't considered. "Explain what you're thinking." I pulled out the notebook where I'd been documenting every aspect of Jenna's criminal activity since her arrest. My sister has been operating these fraud schemes for over a year, stealing approximately $100,000 from victims. That money went somewhere, and if she was sophisticated enough to avoid detection for this long, she was probably sophisticated enough to hide assets. "What makes you think there are recoverable assets?" my father asked. "Several things," I said, consulting my notes. First, she was living well below her reported income, but had expensive possessions that she claimed were gifts or purchases made with your financial support. Second, the FBI found evidence that she was using money laundering techniques to convert stolen funds. Third, she applied for that $30,000 loan even though she was already stealing successfully, which suggests she had specific plans for a large amount of money. I had spent the previous week working with a private investigator named Janet Morrison, using skills I had developed during law school research projects to trace Jenna's financial activities. What we discovered was evidence of a level of planning and sophistication that transformed our understanding of her criminal enterprise. She opened a storage unit 8 months ago under a slightly different variation of her name. I continued showing Mr. Cross the documentation Janet had uncovered. She's been making regular payments on this unit even while claiming she couldn't afford basic living expenses. The storage unit was registered under the name Jennifer L. Henderson, instead of her legal name, Jenna Louise Henderson. A a small change that had allowed her to avoid detection while maintaining plausible deniability if anyone discovered it. The monthly payments were made through automatic withdrawals from a checking account that none of our family knew existed. We also found evidence of a second bank account at a different institution. I continued. This account was opened 13 months ago, right around the time we believe her fraud activities began escalating. Based on deposit patterns, we estimate it contains between $20,000 and $30,000. Marcus leaned forward. How did you trace these accounts if they were opened under false information? They weren't entirely false, I explained. She used variations of her real information, slightly different name spellings, old addresses, my parents' phone number as a backup contact. She was trying to avoid detection, but she also needed the accounts to be legitimate enough to pass basic verification procedures. Mr. Cross was taking notes rapidly, clearly impressed by the thoroughness of our investigation. This changes the strategic picture significantly, he said. If we can demonstrate that recoverable assets exist, we can pursue civil forfeiture proceedings that could provide restitution to victims and potentially clear your parents of financial responsibility for debts they didn't create. The process he outlined was complex but promising. Using civil forfeiture laws originally designed to combat drug trafficking and organized crime, we could petition the court to seize assets that were purchased with proceeds from criminal activity. This would include not just cash in hidden bank accounts, but also expensive items that Jenna had purchased with stolen money. What kind of items are we talking about? My mother asked. I consulted the inventory Janet and I had developed through our investigation. Designer clothing worth approximately $3,000 electronics, including a laptop and tablet jewelry that she claimed were gifts, but were actually purchased with stolen funds and possibly a car that she's been making payments on despite claiming financial hardship. The car was particularly interesting. Jenna had been driving a nearly new Honda Civic that she claimed our parents were helping her purchase, but the loan documents showed that she had provided false income information and made the down payment with funds that could be traced to her fraud activities. Here's what I'm proposing, I said, laying out the strategy I had developed over sleepless nights during the past week. We coordinate with federal prosecutors to ensure that victim restitution is prioritized in any plea agreement Jenna might negotiate. We simultaneously pursue civil asset forfeiture to recover hidden funds and assets, and we document my parents' cooperation with law enforcement to establish their victim status rather than their potential liability. Mr. Cross nodded approvingly. That's a comprehensive approach that addresses both the criminal and civil aspects of the situation, but it will require extensive coordination with multiple law enforcement agencies and probably several months of litigation. How much will this cost? My father asked, the practical concern that had been weighing on all our minds. Here's the good news, Mr. Cross replied. Asset forfeiture cases often operate on contingency arrangements, especially when there's clear evidence of criminal activity. And victim restitution proceedings are typically handled through the prosecutor's office at no cost to the victims. Over the following weeks, our strategy began producing results that exceeded our most optimistic expectations. The storage unit search conducted under warrant revealed not only expensive items that Jenna had purchased with stolen money, but also detailed records of her criminal activities that she had apparently been maintaining for tax evasion purposes. She was treating fraud like a legitimate business, Agent Williams explained during a meeting at the FBI field office. She kept spreadsheets tracking her victims, their personal information, and the amounts she stole from each one. She even calculated quarterly earnings and projected annual income from her criminal activities. The records revealed a level of organization and planning that transformed Jenna from a troubled young woman into a criminal entrepreneur. She had developed standardized scripts for different types of scam approaches, maintained detailed profiles of successful manipulation techniques, and even tracked which dating platforms produced the highest return on investment for her fraud schemes. But the most shocking discovery was evidence that she had been planning to expand her operations internationally, with research files on romance scam techniques used in other countries and preliminary plans for recruiting additional scammers to work under her direction. She was essentially building a criminal organization, Agent Williams continued. If we hadn't caught her when we did, she could have been running a multi-person fraud operation within another year or two. The bank account Janet and I had identified contained $27,000 money that was immediately frozen pending forfeiture proceedings. Additional accounts we discovered through the records in the storage unit brought the total recoverable funds to nearly $40,000. Combined with the value of seized assets and the cooperation of federal prosecutors in prioritizing victim restitution, we were able to create a recovery plan that would reimburse approximately 60% of the money Jenna had stolen from elderly victims. While this wouldn't make the victims whole, it was significantly more than most fraud victims ever recover. The best part, Mr. Cross explained during our final strategy meeting, is that the asset recovery also provides leverage for clearing your parents' credit issues. When we can demonstrate that Jenna had hidden funds available, it becomes much easier to prove that the identity theft was deliberate rather than desperate. 6 weeks after we began implementing our recovery strategy, my parents received a letter from the federal prosecutor's office confirming that they would not face any liability for debts incurred through Jenna's identity theft and that the recovered assets would be applied first to victim restitution and then to clearing fraudulent accounts opened in their names. The financial nightmare wasn't completely over, but for the first time since Jenna's crimes came to light, my parents could see a path forward that didn't involve bankruptcy or financial ruin. More importantly, they could begin to rebuild their reputation in the community and their relationships with Jenna's victims. Harold called the day after the prosecutor's announcement with news that brought tears to my eyes. "The victim support group wanted me to tell your family something," he said. "We've decided to start a fund to help other families who are dealing with similar situations. We want to call it the Henderson Family Recovery Fund in honor of how your parents handled this situation with dignity and cooperation." The idea that our family's name, which had been associated with shame and criminal activity for months, might be remembered instead for resilience and integrity, felt like a gift we didn't deserve. But Harold's wisdom had taught me that sometimes the best response to betrayal is not bitterness, but a commitment to helping others avoid similar pain. As I hung up the phone and shared the news with Marcus, I realized that Jenna's attempt to destroy our family had ultimately brought out qualities we didn't know we possessed. We had learned to fight back strategically rather than emotionally, to seek justice rather than revenge, and to rebuild rather than just survive. The sister I had grown up with was gone, but the family that remained was stronger than it had ever been. And sometimes that kind of transformation is worth the price of the lessons that create it. The federal courthouse in downtown Richmond was an imposing building of granite and glass that seemed designed to remind everyone entering it that justice was serious business. Marcus and I arrived 45 minutes early for Jenna's sentencing hearing, joining my parents and Harold's victim support group in the lobby where we waited nervously for our case to be called. Judge Patricia Williams had a reputation for being thorough, fair, and utterly intolerant of attempts to manipulate the court system. She was in her mid-50s with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of piercing gaze that probably made defendants reconsider their life choices. Her courtroom was decorated with American flags and portraits of previous federal judges, creating an atmosphere of dignity and authority that felt appropriate for the gravity of the proceedings. Jenna was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit and restraints looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her. 3 months in federal custody had stripped away the polished appearance she had always maintained, revealing someone who looked closer to her actual age of 22, rather than the sophisticated persona she had crafted for her criminal activities. Her defense attorney, Michael Rodriguez, was a public defender with 15 years of experience in federal criminal cases. He had negotiated a plea agreement that reduced some of the charges in exchange for Jenna's cooperation with ongoing fraud investigations. But even with the plea deal, she was facing significant prison time. Your Honor, Attorney Rodriguez began when called upon to present mitigation evidence. My client suffers from narcissistic personality disorder and gambling addiction conditions that contributed to her poor decision-making and criminal behavior. We have documentation from court-appointed psychiatrists confirming these diagnoses and recommending treatment rather than purely punitive sentencing. He presented evidence of Jenna's psychological evaluations, including reports that described her as someone with limited ability to empathize with others and a distorted sense of entitlement that had been reinforced by years of family enabling. The psychiatrists recommended intensive therapy and addiction treatment as essential components of any rehabilitation plan. But as Attorney Rodriguez continued his presentation, it became clear that the psychological evaluations had revealed more than just explanations for Jenna's behavior. They had uncovered additional criminal activities that none of us had known about. During the evaluation process, Attorney Rodriguez continued reluctantly, "My client disclosed information about financial crimes she committed beyond those covered in the current charges. She has been stealing from her former employer, a nonprofit organization serving homeless veterans for approximately 18 months." The revelation hit the courtroom like a bomb. Judge Williams' expression darkened as she processed the implications of what she was hearing. Stealing from a charity serving veterans wasn't just another financial crime. It was a betrayal of the most vulnerable members of society. Federal prosecutor James Thompson stood to address the court. Your Honor, this disclosure confirms our assessment that the defendant's criminal behavior is far more extensive and systematic than initially understood. Our investigation into the veterans' charity has revealed that she embezzled approximately $12,000 in donations intended to provide housing assistance for homeless former military personnel. $12,000 stolen from homeless veterans. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, representing a level of callousness that went beyond mere greed into something approaching evil. These were donations from community members who had sacrificed their own resources to help people who had served their country and fallen on hard times. The defendant used her position as a part-time administrative assistant to access donor information and divert funds to personal accounts. Prosecutor Thompson continued, "She specifically targeted recurring donors, redirecting their automatic monthly contributions to accounts under her control. Some of these thefts continued for over a year before being discovered." Judge Williams turned to Jenna directly. "Ms. Henderson, do you understand that you have been stealing money that was intended to help homeless veterans find housing and medical care?" Jenna's voice was barely audible as she responded, "Yes, Your Honor." "And do you understand that your actions may have directly contributed to veterans remaining homeless or being unable to access necessary medical treatment?" "Yes, Your Honor." The exchange continued as Judge Williams methodically established the scope of Jenna's understanding about the consequences of her actions. It became clear that this wasn't just about financial crimes. It was about the human cost of her selfishness and the ripple effects of her choices on some of society's most vulnerable members. Harold had been given permission to speak on behalf of all the elderly victims, and his statement was both heartbreaking and powerful. "Your Honor, I want the court to understand that the defendant didn't just steal our money," he said, his voice carrying the dignity of someone who had spent decades educating young people. "She stole our trust in other human beings. She exploited our loneliness and our desire to help someone we cared about." He described the ongoing impact of Jenna's crimes on the victim community, explaining how many of the elderly targets had become isolated and suspicious, afraid to trust anyone who showed interest in their lives or well-being. The emotional damage went far beyond the financial losses affecting their ability to form new relationships and engage with their communities. "But I also want the court to know," Harold continued, that this experience has taught us about the importance of supporting each other and staying connected. We've formed a support group that meets weekly, and we've created friendships that have enriched our lives in unexpected ways. The defendant intended to divide and exploit us, but instead she brought us together. When it was my turn to speak, I had prepared a victim impact statement that focused on the destruction of family trust and the ongoing consequences for my parents' financial security. But standing in that courtroom, looking at my sister in her orange jumpsuit, I found myself thinking about something more fundamental. Your Honor, I said, my sister destroyed more than property or stole more than money. She destroyed the assumption that family members will protect each other rather than prey on each other. She turned love into a weapon and used our concern for her well-being as a tool to enable her criminal behavior. I described the ongoing impact on my parents' health and financial security, the damage to my professional reputation from her social media attacks, and the broader consequences for our family's standing in the community. But I also talked about the importance of accountability and the need for consequences that would prevent her from victimizing others in the future. I don't want revenge, I concluded. I want justice that protects other potential victims and gives my sister the opportunity to genuinely rehabilitate herself if she's willing to do the hard work that requires. Judge Williams deliberated for nearly 30 minutes before delivering her sentence, consulting case law and sentencing guidelines, while the courtroom waited in tense silence. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of someone who understood the full implications of the case. Ms. Henderson, she began, your crimes represent a systematic betrayal of trust that has caused immeasurable harm to individuals, families, and charitable organizations serving our community's most vulnerable members. The court finds that your actions demonstrate a level of callousness and premeditation that requires significant punishment to serve both justice and deterrence. She sentenced Jenna to 7 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and restitution payments, totaling $96,000 to victims and affected charities. The sentence was longer than the plea agreement had suggested, but shorter than the maximum penalties she could have faced. The court is also ordering that you participate in intensive psychological counseling throughout your incarceration and probation period. Judge Williams continued, your cooperation with ongoing fraud investigations is noted and appreciated, but it does not excuse the magnitude of harm you have caused to innocent people. As the hearing concluded and Jenna was led away to begin her prison sentence, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that I was still processing hours later. Relief that she could no longer harm other victims, sadness for the sister I had lost, and hope that 7 years might be enough time for her to develop genuine remorse and empathy for the people she had hurt. The legal process was finally complete, but the emotional process of rebuilding our family and community was just beginning. Justice had been served, but healing would take much longer than any court proceeding could address. As we left the courthouse, Harold took my arm gently. Your sister will have the opportunity to change if she chooses to take it, he said. 7 years is a long time to think about the consequences of her choices and the people she hurt. Sometimes that's what it takes for someone to finally understand the difference between right and wrong. I hoped he was right. For all our sakes, I hoped that someday the person who emerged from federal prison would be someone capable of genuine remorse, real empathy, and positive contributions to society. But whether or not that transformation occurred, our family had finally learned to protect ourselves and others from her destructive choices. The gavel had fallen, justice had been served, and we could finally begin the long process of moving forward with our lives. 6 months after the sentencing, our lives had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal, though normal now meant something different than it had before Jenna's crimes unraveled our family's foundations. Marcus and I were living in a new apartment closer to downtown, having moved partly for practical reasons, and partly because we needed a fresh start in a space that wasn't connected to the chaos of the previous year. My professional reputation had largely recovered from Jenna's social media attacks, helped by the strong support of my colleagues at Henderson and Associates, and by my proactive work in helping other families navigate similar crises. Janet Henderson had offered me the opportunity to develop a specialty practice in family financial crime cases, working with clients whose loved ones had victimized them through fraud or theft. Your experience gives you a unique perspective that can really help people, Janet explained during my 6-month review. You understand both the legal complexities and the emotional devastation in ways that most attorneys simply cannot. The work was challenging but meaningful, allowing me to channel my experience with Jenna's crimes into something that could help other families avoid or recover from similar betrayals. I had already assisted 3 families in pursuing asset forfeiture cases, helped 2 elderly couples navigate identity theft recovery, and provided guidance to a nonprofit organization that discovered employee embezzlement. My parents had made remarkable progress in rebuilding their financial security and emotional well-being. The asset recovery had eliminated most of their fraudulent debt, and my father's health had improved significantly once the daily stress of collection calls and credit disputes was resolved. They had started attending counseling sessions with a therapist who specialized in family trauma, working through years of enabling behaviors and learning to establish healthier boundaries. "We're learning to distinguish between helping and enabling," my mother explained during one of our weekly dinners. "It's harder than you might think to change patterns that have been in place for decades, but we're committed to doing the work." They had also become involved with Harold's Victim Support Group, which had evolved into a community organization focused on elder fraud prevention and family financial crime education. My father had developed a presentation about identity theft warning signs that he delivered at senior centers and community colleges, turning his painful experience into a tool for protecting other families. But the most unexpected development came on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, when I received a phone call from someone I never expected to hear from again. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Harold Martinez. I hope you remember me." "Of course, Harold," I said, pleased to hear from him. "How are you doing?" "I'm doing well, thank you, but I'm calling because I have some information that I think you and your family should know. It's about your sister." My heart started pounding. Jenna had been in federal prison for 8 months, and we had deliberately avoided contact with her or information about her situation. The therapist we had been seeing had recommended that we focus on our own healing, rather than trying to manage her rehabilitation from the outside. "What kind of information?" I asked cautiously. "I've been corresponding with her," Harold said. "I know that probably sounds strange, but after the trial I felt like I wanted to understand what had motivated her actions. I started writing to her as part of my own healing process." Harold explained that he had begun writing to Jenna shortly after her sentencing initially as a way to process his own anger and confusion about being victimized. What had started as an exercise in emotional healing had developed into a genuine correspondence that had given him insights into Jenna's psychological state and rehabilitation progress. "She's changed, Wendy," Harold said, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and cautious optimism. "I mean genuinely changed, not just saying what she thinks people want to hear. She's been participating in every available counseling program, working with a prison psychologist who specializes in personality disorders. And she's been providing information about other fraud operations that has led to additional arrests." Harold read me excerpts from Jenna's recent letters, which were markedly different from any communication I had ever received from her. Instead of self-pity and blame-shifting, her words reflected genuine remorse and accountability for her actions. She had written detailed apologies to each of her victims, not asking for forgiveness, but taking responsibility for the specific harms she had caused. She asked me to help her understand the impact of her crimes on each victim. Harold continued. She wants to write individual letters of apology, but only if the victims want to receive them. She's not asking for forgiveness or reduced sentences. She just wants people to know that she understands what she did was wrong. The idea that Jenna might actually be developing genuine empathy and remorse was both hopeful and difficult to accept. After years of manipulation and false promises, how could any of us know whether this transformation was real or just another performance designed to manipulate the parole system? "Has she asked about our family?" I asked. "She has," Harold admitted, "but not in the way you might expect. She asked me to make sure you knew that she doesn't expect forgiveness and isn't looking for renewed contact. She said she understands that she destroyed your trust and that rebuilding it, if it's even possible, would be a long process that would have to be entirely on your family's terms." Harold's description of his correspondence with Jenna continued for nearly an hour, painting a picture of someone who was finally confronting the reality of her actions and their consequences. She had developed friendships with other inmates who were working on rehabilitation, had earned her GED, and was planning to pursue college courses through the prison's education program. Most significantly, she had been working with federal investigators to help them understand and prosecute romance scam operations, using her insider knowledge to protect potential victims and assist in criminal cases. Her cooperation had already led to the arrests of 6 other scammers and the recovery of over $50,000 in stolen funds. "The warden told me that she's one of the most cooperative inmates they've had in their fraud rehabilitation program," Harold said. "But more importantly, the psychologist working with her believes that her remorse is genuine and that she's developing the emotional skills she lacked before." After the call ended, I found myself in the strange position of feeling cautiously hopeful about my sister for the first time in years. If Harold's assessment was accurate, if the transformation was real, then perhaps the 7-year sentence would actually serve its intended purpose of rehabilitation rather than just punishment. Marcus and I spent several evenings discussing whether we wanted to know more about Jenna's situation or whether we should continue maintaining our distance. The therapist we had been seeing helped us understand that both choices were valid and that we could change our approach as our own healing progressed. "The important thing," she explained, "is that you make decisions based on what's healthy for you and your marriage, not based on guilt or family pressure. Your sister's rehabilitation is her responsibility, and your healing is yours." A month later, I made the decision to write a brief letter to the federal prison, not to Jenna directly, but to her counselor, expressing my willingness to receive information about her rehabilitation progress. I wasn't ready for direct contact, but I wanted to stay informed about whether the changes Harold described were continuing. The response I received confirmed that Jenna was participating actively in counseling education and victim services programs. She had developed a reputation as someone who genuinely helped other inmates understand the impact of financial crimes on victims, and her cooperation with law enforcement had resulted in significant prosecutions of ongoing fraud operations. "Your sister has made remarkable progress in developing empathy and understanding the consequences of her actions," the counselor wrote. "While I cannot predict her long-term success, I can say that the changes I've observed appear to be genuine and sustained." As winter turned to spring, our family continued the slow process of rebuilding and recovering from the damage Jenna's crimes had caused. We were learning to trust each other again, to communicate more honestly about our feelings and boundaries, and to recognize the difference between love and enabling. The wounds were still healing and probably always would be to some extent, but we were stronger than we had been before, more honest about our relationships, and better equipped to protect ourselves and others from similar betrayals in the future. If Jenna's transformation was genuine, if she was truly developing into someone capable of remorse and positive contributions to society, then perhaps some good could eventually come from all the pain she had caused. But whether or not that happened, our family had learned to build our happiness and security on our own choices rather than depending on her to change. And that independence, that emotional self-sufficiency, felt like the most important victory of all. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in late spring, 18 months after Jenna's sentencing, and 6 months after I had begun receiving periodic updates about her rehabilitation progress. The return address was familiar. the federal correctional institution where she was serving her sentence. But this letter was different from the official reports I had been receiving from her counselor. This one was addressed to me personally in handwriting I recognized, despite the years that had passed since I had seen it. Marcus found me sitting at our kitchen table, staring at the unopened envelope with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. We discussed the possibility that Jenna might eventually want to communicate directly, and I had told her counselor that I would be willing to read a letter if certain conditions were met. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked, gently sitting down beside me. "I think so," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what ready meant in this context. The letter was 4 pages long, written in the careful handwriting of someone who had taken considerable time to choose their words precisely. But what struck me immediately was the tone. There was none of the manipulation or self-pity that had characterized Jenna's previous communications. Instead, her words carried a weight of responsibility and genuine reflection that I had never seen from her before. "Dear Wendy," it began. "I know that anything I say to you will sound inadequate compared to the pain I've caused, but I need you to know that I finally understand what I did to you, to our family, and to all the people I victimized through my crimes." She described her first year in prison as a process of gradual awakening to the reality of her actions and their consequences. The intensive therapy sessions, the confrontation with victim stories, and the daily reality of being surrounded by other people whose poor choices had led them to federal custody had forced her to confront aspects of her personality and behavior that she had spent years avoiding. "I used to think that I was just someone who had bad luck who couldn't catch a break in life," she wrote. "I blamed you for being more successful. I blamed our parents for not giving me enough support, and I blamed my victims for being naive enough to trust me. It took me months of counseling to understand that I was the common denominator in all of these situations." The letter continued with detailed acknowledgments of specific harms she had caused, written with a level of insight and empathy that surprised me. She understood that stealing from our grandmother wasn't just about money. It was about violating the trust of someone who loved her unconditionally. She recognized that destroying my wedding cake wasn't just property damage. It was an attack on one of the most important days of my life. But the section that affected me most deeply was her reflection on the elderly victims she had scammed through her romance fraud schemes. "I've been working with a victim impact counselor who helped me understand what loneliness feels like for people who have lost their spouses after decades of marriage," she wrote. "I created fake relationships with people who were genuinely looking for companionship, and I exploited their grief and hope for my own financial gain. I stole more than their money. I stole their ability to trust other people and damaged their faith in human goodness." Jenna described how she had been working with federal investigators to help them understand and prosecute romance scam operations, using her insider knowledge to protect potential victims and assist in criminal cases. Her cooperation had led to the arrests of 12 additional scammers and the development of educational materials that were being used by law enforcement agencies across multiple states. "I can't undo the damage I caused," she wrote, "but I can make sure that other people don't fall victim to the kinds of schemes I used to run. I've been working with the FBI's Fraud Prevention Unit to develop training materials for elderly community centers, and I've provided testimony in 6 federal cases against other romance scammers." The letter also included information about her educational progress and future plans. She had earned her GED, completed college-level courses in psychology and social work, and was planning to pursue a degree in victim services after her release. She had also been accepted into an intensive addiction treatment program that addressed the gambling issues that had contributed to her criminal behavior. "I know that I destroyed your trust and that rebuilding it, if it's even possible, would take years of consistent good behavior," she wrote near the end of the letter. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, and I'm not asking for renewed contact with our family. I just wanted you to know that the person who committed those crimes is not who I want to be anymore." The letter concluded with something I had never received from Jenna before: a genuine apology that took full responsibility for her actions without making excuses or asking for anything in return. "I am deeply sorry for the pain I caused you, Marcus, our parents, and all of my victims. My actions were inexcusable, and their consequences were entirely my responsibility. I hope that someday I will be able to contribute something positive to the world to balance against the harm I've caused, but I understand that the people I hurt are not obligated to forgive me or give me that opportunity." After reading the letter, Marcus and I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the implications of what Jenna had written. The tone and content were so different from anything she had communicated before that it was almost like hearing from a completely different person. "What do you think?" Marcus asked eventually. "I think she sounds different," I said carefully. "But I also think it will take a lot more than one letter to prove that the changes are real and lasting." Over the following weeks, I consulted with our family therapist, Harold, and even Agent Williams about how to interpret Jenna's letter and whether it represented genuine rehabilitation or sophisticated manipulation. The consensus was cautiously optimistic. The specific content and tone suggested genuine reflection, but the true test would be her behavior over time, particularly after her release. Harold, who had been corresponding with Jenna, regularly confirmed that her letters to him showed consistent evidence of growth and genuine remorse. "She's been helping other inmates understand the impact of their financial crimes," he explained. "The prison counselors tell me that she's become a resource for other women who are struggling to understand why their actions were wrong." Most significantly, Jenna had refused several opportunities to apply for early release or reduce sentences, stating that she needed to serve her full sentence as appropriate consequences for her crimes. This decision, more than her words, suggested that her transformation might be genuine. 3 months after receiving her letter, I made the decision to write a brief response, not offering forgiveness or renewed relationship, but acknowledging her apparent growth and expressing hope for her continued rehabilitation. I set clear boundaries about future communication and explained that any relationship between us would depend on years of consistent good behavior after her release. "I'm glad to hear about your progress," I wrote. "The person you describe in your letter sounds like someone who might be capable of positive contributions to society. I hope that person continues to develop and grow stronger over the remaining years of your sentence." I also included information about our family's healing and recovery, making it clear that we had built happy, successful lives that were independent of her choices or rehabilitation. Whether or not she continued to grow and change, we would be fine. The letter I received in response was brief and gracious, thanking me for my willingness to communicate and reaffirming her commitment to rehabilitation without expecting anything from our family in return. It was the kind of response that suggested she truly understood the boundaries I had set and the work she still needed to do. As I filed her letters away in a folder labeled Jenna Prison Correspondence, I reflected on how much our family had changed since her crimes first came to light. We had learned to distinguish between love and enabling, between forgiveness and reconciliation, between hope for someone's rehabilitation and dependence on their good behavior for our own happiness. The sister I had grown up with was gone, but perhaps in her place was someone who might eventually become a person worthy of cautious respect. The transformation wasn't complete and it might not be permanent, but for the first time in years it felt possible that Jenna might actually become someone capable of genuine remorse and positive contributions to society. Whether or not that possibility became reality, our family had learned to build our happiness and security on our own choices and relationships. We had survived betrayal, rebuilt our lives, and discovered strengths we never knew we possessed. And sometimes that kind of resilience is the most important victory of all. 5 years have passed since that devastating Saturday evening when Jenna destroyed my wedding cake and stole my rings, and as I sit in the law office that now bears my name, Patterson Family Recovery Law, I find myself reflecting on the journey that brought me to this moment. The afternoon sunlight streams through windows that overlook a thriving downtown area, illuminating diplomas and certificates that represent not just my professional achievements, but my family's resilience in the face of unimaginable betrayal. Marcus and I celebrated our 6th anniversary last month with a quiet dinner at home, sharing homemade chocolate cake, while our 2-year-old daughter Grace played with building blocks on the living room floor. The simplicity of that evening, just the 3 of us, no elaborate decorations or expensive venues, felt more meaningful than any grand celebration could have been. We had learned that the most profound joys are found in ordinary moments shared with people who truly love and support each other. My parents have become different people over these 5 years, transformed by the necessity of confronting truths they had avoided for decades. They completed 2 years of family therapy and have developed the kind of honest communication skills that should have been established when Jenna and I were children. My father's health recovered completely once the financial stress was resolved, and my mother has channeled her nurturing instincts into volunteer work with elderly fraud victims rather than enabling destructive behavior. We learned that love without boundaries isn't actually love, my mother explained during a recent dinner conversation. It's just fear disguised as affection. Real love sometimes requires us to allow people to experience the consequences of their choices. Their relationship has deepened and strengthened through the crisis built now on a foundation of mutual respect and shared commitment to healthy boundaries. They've become advocates in our community for elder fraud prevention, sharing their story to help other families recognize and address financial abuse before it destroys relationships and security. The legal practice I've built focuses exclusively on helping families navigate financial crimes committed by loved ones. The expertise I gained through our experience with Jenna has become a powerful tool for helping other families recover assets, pursue justice, and rebuild their lives after betrayal. I've assisted 47 families over the past 4 years, helping them recover over $2 million in stolen funds and providing guidance through the complex emotional terrain of loving someone who has victimized you. Harold remains a close friend and mentor, though he passed away peacefully 18 months ago, surrounded by the victim support community that had become his chosen family. At his funeral, over 200 people gathered to honor a man who had transformed his own victimization into a force for protection and healing in his community. His victim support group continues to meet weekly, now led by a team of volunteers who learned from his example that strength can emerge from the most devastating betrayals. Before his death, Harold shared one final piece of wisdom that has guided my approach to both my professional work and my personal healing. The people who hurt us teach us just as much as the people who love us, he said. Sometimes they teach us about boundaries, sometimes about resilience, and sometimes about the difference between justice and revenge. The question isn't whether we'll learn from difficult people. The question is what we choose to learn. Jenna was released from federal prison 8 months ago after serving her full 7-year sentence. She chose not to request early release or participate in halfway house programs, stating in her final letter to the court that she wanted to serve her complete sentence as appropriate accountability for her crimes. Upon release, she moved to a different state, where she had been accepted into a victim services program, working with elderly fraud victims to help them navigate recovery and protection services. We have maintained limited contact through her victim services supervisor, receiving periodic updates about her work and rehabilitation progress. The reports consistently describe someone who has maintained the personal growth that began during her incarceration, someone who channels her understanding of manipulation tactics into protecting vulnerable people rather than exploiting them. "Your sister has become one of our most effective counselors," her supervisor wrote in a recent update. Her insight into the psychology of financial predators allows her to help victims understand what happened to them and develop strategies for avoiding future victimization. Jenna has not requested renewed contact with our family, respecting the boundaries we established years ago. She sends a brief card on my birthday and Grace's birthday each year, not asking for responses, but simply acknowledging important moments in our lives. The cards are appropriate and respectful, expressing hope for our continued happiness without inserting herself into our celebrations. Marcus and I have decided to tell Grace about her aunt when she's old enough to understand complex family dynamics, but we'll frame the story as a lesson about choices and consequences rather than a source of family shame. We want her to understand that people she loves are capable of disappointing her, but that those disappointments don't define her worth or limit her potential for happiness. Everyone has someone in their family who makes bad choices, Marcus said during one of our conversations about how to handle this topic. The important thing is that Grace learns to love people without being responsible for their decisions. My professional work has taught me that our family's experience, while devastating, is unfortunately not unique. Financial crimes committed by family members affect thousands of families each year, destroying trust and security in ways that often go unreported and unaddressed. The legal system is slowly developing better tools for handling these cases, but the emotional recovery process remains a largely individual journey that each family must navigate based on their own values and circumstances. The most important lesson I've learned is that forgiveness and reconciliation are separate processes that don't necessarily occur together. I have forgiven Jenna in the sense that I no longer carry anger about her actions, but that forgiveness doesn't obligate me to restore the relationship we had before her crimes. Forgiveness can be a gift you give yourself independent of whether the person who hurt you deserves it or has earned it. Justice, I've discovered, is also more complex than I once understood. True justice isn't just about punishment, it's about accountability, protection of potential future victims, and the opportunity for rehabilitation when that's possible. Jenna's sentence served all of these purposes, providing consequences for her actions while creating space for the personal growth that allows her to contribute positively to society today. The financial recovery we achieved through asset forfeiture and victim restitution funds helped our family rebuild, but the emotional recovery required something different. A commitment to building our happiness on relationships and choices we could control, rather than depending on other people's good behavior for our security and peace of mind. As I finish writing notes for tomorrow's client meetings and prepare to head home for dinner with my family, I find myself grateful for lessons I never wanted to learn. Jenna's betrayal taught us about resilience we didn't know we possessed, showed us the difference between love and enabling, and ultimately made us stronger and more authentic in all our relationships. The sister I grew up with is gone, but the family that survived her crimes is built on a foundation of truth, mutual respect, and healthy boundaries that will protect Grace from the dysfunction that enabled Jenna's destructive choices. We've learned to celebrate ordinary moments to trust, but verify, and to find joy in relationships that are based on reciprocal care rather than one-sided sacrifice. Sometimes the worst betrayals clear the way for the most authentic relationships, and sometimes losing someone we thought we loved allows us to discover the people who truly deserve our trust and affection. Tonight, Marcus and I will read bedtime stories to Grace, grateful for the simple blessing of a family built on honesty and mutual respect. Tomorrow, I'll help another family navigate the complex terrain of financial betrayal, using our experience to guide them toward recovery and healing. And someday, perhaps Jenna will have rebuilt enough trust and demonstrated enough consistent good behavior that we might consider a carefully boundaried relationship. But whether or not that day comes, our family's happiness and security are no longer dependent on her choices. We've learned to build our lives on the love we can trust, the relationships that serve us all well, and the choices that reflect our values rather than our fears. And in the end, that independence and authenticity feel like the most valuable gifts we could have received, even if they came through a path we never would have chosen. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with someone you love to protect yourself and your family? Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when it means losing the relationship we thought we had. I'd love to hear your thoughts about forgiveness, accountability, and the difference between love and enabling in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to hear more stories about resilience, family dynamics, and the courage it takes to protect yourself from people who want to take advantage of your kindness. And please share this with anyone who might be struggling with similar situations. Sometimes knowing that others have survived and rebuilt can provide the strength needed to make difficult but necessary choices. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your worth and happiness are not determined by other people's choices. You have the power to build a life based on truth, respect, and authentic relationships, no matter what challenges you may be facing right now. Until next time, protect your peace and trust your instincts.